We can go ahead and take our seats. We'll get started here in just a minute. So welcome back. Hope everybody had a great lunch. Before we get back to the committee's discussion, we did want to just respond to the question that was raised about the outcomes to be considered within some of the outcomes like cardiovascular disease, body weight, type 2 diabetes. Those are also cross-cutting outcomes across a number of questions in the subcommittees. But the NESR has done a lot of work in those topic areas in the past, so we have more of a foundation. So as Janet noted, the next step is the NESR is pulling together draft protocols to bring to the subcommittees for the subcommittees to respond to. So we kind of already have a base for like cardiovascular disease to bring to y'all. For the outcomes like neurocognitive health as well as cancer, those are ones that we just don't have as much foundational work, so we thought it would be good to have that discussion here today. Now, when those protocols come to you, you obviously have the option to revise any of the outcomes, but these are ones we just needed a little bit more foundational discussion.
And I know some of that information will be posted on the website, so if you could maybe let people know when that would be posted.
Absolutely, so thank you. So at dietaryguidelines.gov, we walked through this yesterday, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in the closing remarks, but there is a section on dietaryguidelines.gov under work underway, and it is under the review of the science section, and there's a list of all of the questions, systematic review questions, as well as data analysis and food pattern modeling questions. Once a month, we'll update those. So if there is a protocol that comes to the subcommittee that the subcommittee has discussed, once a month we'll do kind of an update so the public can see that draft protocol, where it is. And then in the next month, if there have been revisions, we'll update it and note the revisions to that protocol. So the public can follow along in this process once a month with our monthly updates.
Thank you. So we are going to move then to the discussion of the neurocognitive outcomes, and I've asked Dr. Kleiman to lead that discussion.
Thanks, Barbara. So I thought perhaps we could start with the neurocognitive outcomes from the 2020 guidelines, and these are up here now, and begin to sort of look at it in that framework. Meaning, are these still appropriate for the work that we're going to be doing? Try to fill in the question marks around age, and are there additional ones that we want to add to this, or are some of these not appropriate for the current work? So I'd like to turn this over to you for your thoughts on it, and we'll start with the first one, developmental milestones. I think also it's important to acknowledge that neurocognitive outcomes are a pretty large set of domains, and that they're not easy to measure at all ages, so just keeping that in mind. Okay.
Yeah, this is Kay Dewey. For the birth to 2 years, I'm wondering if we should consider visual acuity as an indicator, because it's been measured in a number of studies and it's related to omega-3 fatty acid status.
This is Reagan Bailey, just following up on that. I wrote that down, and also visual evoked potential. Consider them together.
Yeah, I had that on my list too. And we could potentially just put that in retina development or visual function development, I guess, and that'll bring all of the ways we measure that, including evoked potentials as well as the less accurate ones. Okay. Other thoughts? The question mark there, birth to question years, so in part I think that relates to the tests that we have available to measure cognitive development, and age and stage are mentioned there, as well as the Bailey scores. and they do have definitive time periods. Bailey scores, I think, go up to 4.5, age 4.5. And the age and stage is a little bit longer. I think it's around 6 years, 5.5 to 6 years. So any thoughts about that, Linda?
Not specifically about that, but in some of the work we're doing currently, we're looking at developmental assets and vulnerabilities in young children. And there is some work, I don't know exactly about the scores or the titles of those scores, but I know at Northwestern anyway, there's a strong department that's working on this, and it relates to executive function and other behavioral characteristics that are initiated as early as age 2. So that's a growing field, and that's about all I can say about it.
So I think we would be safe using current measures, ASQ and Bailey scores, if we say birth to 2 years, because that's well within the scope of those tests, and they're pretty commonly used in the literature. Is there any further thoughts about that?
This is Kay Dewey again. I want to make sure that language development is included in people's concept of the developmental indices there, because language development during the first 2 years is a really useful outcome. Do you think that's more under communication? Oh, receptive and expressive. They're included within the Bailey, but just so we're clear that language development is a part of that domain.
Okay, then why don't we go from birth to 18 years and talk about that a little bit. One condition that is very prevalent now is attention deficit disorder. And so I don't know whether that's picked up under executive functioning or whether we need to explicitly ask for that. But I wondered about your thoughts. And we could also talk about autism spectrum disorder, since that is also frequently now rightly or wrongly tied to nutrition and diet. So I just put that out there for some more conversation. Anybody want to converse?
I agree with you. I think those domains are really important. There's one listed there called neurological development, which to me is not well defined. And I would say that what you described could be called neurobehavioral development. And I think we should be pretty inclusive on this list.
Yeah, it seems like we have good agreement on that. Why don't we recommend that we scratch neurological development? It meant nothing to me either, and we're so specific about these other domains. I don't think we're going to lose anything by taking that out. But let's be explicit about ASD and ADHD, whether they fall into under the as subcategories underneath neurobehavioral development. We should be able to capture that. Good. And then we move into neurocognitive health, 18 years and beyond. So the first thought was that Alzheimer's disease is a subtype of dementia. And so I think it can be explicit, but it ought to be specified under dementia. And I don't know who mentioned stroke, but I remember hearing that a little while ago. Oh, Linda. So I think we'd want to include all causes of dementia: Alzheimer's disease, stroke, hypertension, and other vascular issues that lead to compromise that way. And someone mentioned working memory earlier, and yeah, right. So do we want to put that on there specifically in addition to dementia, or is there a way we can describe that so that when they search, that'll come up?
Well, there are any number of the adult cognitive scales that are, used to describe relative cognitive function. So it's usually some type of combined battery that includes working memory, among others. There's a paper on which ones are the most commonly used tests. I'm just surprised that there's no testing in there, but there's testing in the birth to 18 years. That was what I was wondering about, because it doesn't get anything subclinical. It only gets, you've got dementia, you've got one of these specific things. So is cognitive impairment broad enough to cover those things?
So this is Reagan. Are you suggesting we put in indicator tests like the mini mental or the Hopkins verbal fluency, those types of things? I think if we want to be specific like we are in the younger age groups, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I was confused by the cognitive impairment because there's a specific diagnosis, mild cognitive impairment, so it's not that. It's not listed as that here, and it's also not listed as the test, so I wasn't sure. Yeah, cognitive function would encompass all of it.
Or we could, I think cognitive function sounds very good, and we could extend that to say cognitive function as determined by standardized testing. And then perhaps we could add EG and several of those that you've just brought up. So can you just tell us a couple so we've got those in the record, and then they'll come back to us.
The mini mental status that Dr. Bailey mentioned was
The
standard.
Hopkins verbal fluency. There's the one where you name so many animals in
That's
so
the
many
Boston
seconds.
naming test, I think. And they're a wide variety.
It's ironic that I can't remember them.
Yeah, so just mentioning them.
I was going to say I'd comment, but I think I flunked the last one, right? Okay, so I think that's definitely getting
Digit substitution test, the DSST. I know all the acronyms, I just don't know what the DSST.
Just a real quick point, we don't list the tests up in the birth to 18 years as well, so I'm just wondering, when you look at there, isn't executive function, couldn't that also be down below with neurocognitive health, because they're actually assessing similar components in terms of working memory, planning, goal-directed behavior, and within that, you have a lot of those cognitive performance tests that are within that?
Yeah, so maybe that's another place where we would say cognitive functioning in that first bullet, and then there would be a sub-bullet under EG, academic performance, IQ, comma, executive functioning, and these other domains. So that ought to be, I think, folded into those parentheses. Is that?
Well, I just feel like whatever's in the second one with birth to 18 could also be put down with 18 and older to keep it consistent.
Okay.
Because a lot of those outcomes the indices are, you would want to put them in the other one below.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So let's change both of those.
Just for consistency, I think, just to
Yeah,
keep them.
yeah. Let's change both in both of those categories, birth to 18 and then 18 plus. Let's make it cognitive functioning and give some examples of the testing that can be done for that, and then underneath it, expand working memory, executive function, academic performance, IQ, and et cetera. Great.
Yes.
Oh,
Yes, Joan Sabate. Sure. I have a semantic comment here. I think on the second group is relates to the cognitive development. However, in the third one is preservation of this. That's why they use the word health. So this is more related, I think, to the increasing in whatever functions were acquired, and the third one is the preservation. That's why what I'm saying is cognitive development in the third category probably is not the best semantics. Because in the third category is talking about clinical entities, not the development.
So how would
probably,
yeah.
Besides the clinical entities, I'm making another comment. Probably the most common in the third category is the age-related cognitive decline. So We don't have to wait until a clinical entity appears, I mean, to see if there is a connection. Is the preservation of the cognition, whatever it is, that probably is also relevant.
So how would we say that? Instead of cognitive impairment, say preservation of cognitive function or preservation of cognitive health?
That could be a way to say that, but.
Okay, I think that's a good point.
So I'm wondering if a way to get at your question is you're looking at risk for impairment. I think you're looking at risk for impairment. So you're trying to get ahead of the clinical sign and say, are there things that tell me you're now increasing risk for impairment? Is that what you're trying to get at?
I mixed two concepts. I think the cognitive development that was proposed to put here, I said the first concept is probably not the best way to do so. Because on the third paragraph, on the third category, is not the development. By development, typically is associated with growing, increasing. On the third one, is more related to preservation or less deterioration. That's the first.
Yeah, that's why I was introducing
correct.
the concept of risk, sort of in that third area.
And in the third area, the typical thing that happens with age is age-related cognitive decline. So the preservation of the cognition or assessing the risk of increasing the decline or accelerating the decline due to age is probably the outcome that we try to measure here.
So we actually perhaps should just say that, preservation of neurocognitive health as the title of that outcome, and then we can change cognitive impairment to cognitive functioning and do what we talked about with dementia, Alzheimer's, and the other causes of dementia at that age. Does that make it better? Okay. All right. So with that, review questions that address neurocognitive related outcomes. Do you want to go through these questions, or now that we have these outcomes specified, should we leave it to each of the working groups to take these outcomes and match them to their categories? And I'm counting the nodding around the table, and I think I'm getting consensus. So anybody who disagrees with doing it that way? Okay.
Yes, and I would like to just double check with the staff. You can now ask us questions if something we've said is not clear. So is it clear what we've agreed to? Okay, great.
All right. I hate to say this, but I think we've done it. Yeah. All right. Thank you all. So we're going to move on to cancer.
Yeah, we can move on to the cancer. And as we heard earlier, that these are the 4 most common cancers. They were what were looked at with the 2015-2020 dietary guidelines, and they remain the most common. So I think what the staff is asking us, do we have the right cancers here? Are we missing something? Does something no longer belong on the list? And so that's what we want the input from the committee on. Carol, can...
So this is Carol Boucher. And with, with the increase in ectopic fat, I was thinking we may want to look at liver and pancreatic cancer.
Yeah, I think liver is an excellent idea. That's probably the most directly related to body composition, and body composition is pretty directly related to diet, and so that seems to definitely belong on there. I had raised earlier the relationship of childhood cancers and diet, and I think it was Eve or somebody who mentioned that ALL and human milk or breastfeeding is being looked at in the beta 24. But how about those other cancers that are common in childhood, or are the common cancers in childhood, as opposed to these, which are the common cancers in adult years? And I was specifically thinking about about leukemias, but in addition, lymphoma, neuroblastoma, bone tumors, osteosarcoma. So could we just group those as the relationship between diet and cancers that are the most common in childhood, and leave it at that? So at least there's some work to do on that, some review to do on that. Okay. All right, so there's consensus for that too, so we'll plan on that.
And of the four that have been listed, do those stay on the list, or is there any sense that we don't need to continue? I think what we heard from Julie earlier is that with prostate cancer, I think there was just no evidence. With lung cancer, it was limited evidence. So keep them on? Does anyone think we should take them off the list? Let me ask the question that way. So we've made the list longer.
I think what we don't know is if literature's come along over the last few years that now perhaps shifts the prostate back, or one of them in the other direction, so probably want to err in gathering more information. Linda.
Just one comment about all of this, in the sense that, at least from most of the major overviews of cancer literature, at least from my point of view, it so relates to the development of obesity. And so, you know, I think as we go forward, it's possible that we should, you know, recognize that it's that connection, regardless of what the diet composition is, it's the energy balance issue, you know, that really promotes cancer development in so many ways. And so, you know, attempting to try to keep that in the back of our heads as we look at these various dietary factors, you know, the energy balance question certainly needs to be included somehow.
So that sounds like something that the subcommittee will be wanting to look at. Is there evidence around the energy balance issue related to the cancers that we've identified?
Hi, this is Carol Boucher. And really to layer over that is diet quality. You know, because you can consume 2,000 calories, and it can be in high diet quality, 2,000 calories, and it can be the lowest diet quality at 2,000 kilocalories. So it's something that we really, I think, need to put into the mix, since that's really our task, you know, as dietary guidelines. But I don't want us to lose sight of that as part of this picture that you painted out.
Lydia Pisano. So I do have one question. We were talking about colorectal cancer, and then we also are mentioning now liver. Are we thinking maybe we should consider it as a system, the GI system? I mean, this is just a question. Yes, colorectal is the most common cancer, but others also have associations with certain things.
I consider myself a recovering gastroenterologist, so I'll I think that if we say it that way, that we lose the emphasis on the ones that most make a difference to the population. And by putting liver in there, we can draw that relationship to obesity because it's 1-to-1. And if we do all of GI cancers, we bring in hereditary cancers. An awful lot of GI cancer is due to polyps, which are hereditary, or syndromes and so on. So I think in this case, we're probably better off being discreet, but just my thinking about it.
Rachel Navani. So I guess this gets back, I think, to Heather's question from earlier, that really most of the outcomes we're going to be looking at have an obesity relationship. And so maybe just to note that in the analysis, we'll at some point consider the role of obesity in the modeling. The details of that, I don't know that we need to talk about right now, but I would think that would be true with most of our outcomes.
Just to respond a little bit to your comment, Ron, that under the beverages subcommittee, there are several questions about alcohol consumption and certain types of cancer, and I just wonder if stomach or any of the others might be, I don't know enough about this subject, I just wanted to bring it up. The alcohol is highlighted in some of the questions.
And so with a thought towards being more inclusive about GI cancer. Yeah, I guess in that particular case, but I would make it specific for alcohol and GI cancer. So I think there to be more focused, because we're focusing on one particular toxin or potential toxin. That seems to make a lot of sense to me. So if everyone agrees, then in the beverage, under the beverage topic, we would specifically relate alcohol and broaden the category to GI cancers. And that would include esophageal, stomach, and lower tract cancers. And I was, when Rachel, you must have been reading my mind, because as Linda was talking, I was thinking exactly the same thing, that obesity really underpins just about every health outcome that we're talking about here. So we want that probably to be a common thread also. And as we're thinking about this developmentally, that's clearly an important area that's going to come up. So perhaps if we're thinking about cross-cutting themes, that one ought to be in the background all the time.
Do we have other comments from the committee? So let me just, are you guys good for where we are? Do you have any questions for any of the committee members to how to proceed? Okay, great.
I have one. Jamie Ard. So on these cancer outcomes, I know for everything else we're talking about, risk and I guess sort of incidence. For cancer, are we also going to be thinking about mortality outcomes related to cancer? Because, right, for example, breast cancer, women who gain weight during treatment have increased risk of mortality and recurrence. So those are some important sort of considerations. It's not just the dietary pattern and then the risk of the disease, but it may also be, I mean, what we care about a lot for cancer, obviously, is mortality. And so would we include or think about outcomes related to death from cancer?
This is Elsie Tamaris, or more generally, survivorship. And that's actually a very good point. I wonder if that's within the scope. Particularly, I think, also with pediatric malignancies, is that there's an emerging literature on
on cancer survivorship and diet. So I think that would be good to include if it's within the scope.
I think the one place that we have to be a little cautious of is, we've heard repeatedly that we're not looking at clinical guidelines. So I appreciate what Jamie was getting at, that I would think of mortality from cancer as one of the outcomes that would be picked up through the systematic reviews. But as soon as we start getting into how do you manage a patient with cancer, I think that starts to get into a different question. And it's not that we can't look at that literature. I think we just have to be careful. This microphone doesn't like me. We just have to be careful that we don't sort of trip over and start looking at clinical guidelines, clinical practice for treating.
This is Carol Boucher, and just a pragmatic comment exactly to what you were saying. If we were to be doing systematic reviews, the greatest number of publications would be with mortality, and then there is now growing in survival, and certainly that would be a path to consider also.
In response to this, Joan Sabater.
Should I turn hello? Can you hear me now? Hello. I think that one's, can you pass one down to him?
I think the survival issue is perhaps outside the scope of this committee, because I think the scope of this committee is to craft dietary guidelines for the general population, not for the disease population in general, although, I mean, it could be with some prevalent issues like obesity or hypertension, but I think particular dietary advice, I mean, for people with a specific disease, I think is outside the scope of this committee.
Other comments? Again, Julie or Eve, do you have any questions for the committee that you'd like to ask? Okay, great. So I think is that the end of our formal agenda? Okay. So I know Eve has some comments. I'd like to just see if the committee, and I know people have flights, so we're going to start losing people. So Kay, I'm going to catch you first before you walk out the door. It was very helpful yesterday just to have the committee's perceptions, questions, and comments. Not that we're going to get responses to everything right now, but it would be useful if we could do that again. So before we lose everyone, I'd like to do that.
Thank you, Barbara. Kay Dewey. So actually, the one point I wanted to raise, I had a very useful lunchtime conversation around some of the practical issues for the Beta 24 subcommittee. And as I brought up earlier, there are some questions for the other subcommittees, and we want to work closely with those on them. But in particular, on our list of questions in sort of the middle group, there are several outcomes, including body composition and growth and bone health and nutrient status, but not developmental outcomes. And this has to do with 4 nutrients: iron, vitamin D, omega-3, and vitamin B12. And we saw in another subcommittee for the fats and seafood that the relationship between various types of dietary fats and neurodevelopmental outcomes was part of that at every stage of the life cycle. So we just wanted to sort of flag that that's something very, very appropriate to one of the areas that we need to also explore. So it's just a general issue that hopefully the subcommittees can sort of discuss amongst themselves, that maybe some questions will get kind of handled over here and others over there, depending on the life stage that's in question. So that was the main thing I wanted to bring up.
Lydia Bazzano. So in terms of the dietary patterns, I did have a question that was related to the questions as listed here. On the dietary pattern subcommittee, the list of dietary patterns includes Mediterranean style, dietary approaches to stop hypertension, vegetarian, vegan, low carbohydrate diets, and high fat diets. And I'm wondering if they're separate, those are two separate things? What kind of high fat diets are we talking about? That's usually a low carbohydrate diet, so I just didn't know if that was two separate things, so yeah. I'm just wondering.
So we'll just collect the questions and then we can maybe, as part of the closing, we can have those addressed.
I guess I'd raise two issues or questions to keep in mind. Again, when we talk about patterns, dietary patterns, we've put an emphasis on foods and nutrients, but I think we really have to talk about temporal patterns as well. We have eating frequency as one of our big questions, and I think we have to integrate across those. The other is I fully endorse the idea of having obesity as sort of a covariate in everything that we do. But does that raise then the question of should we be thinking about macronutrients specifically in each of these roles, or is it just obesity?
No, we're just going to go. Oh, I see. You'll get an answer. You'll get another turn.
Rachel Navani. The thing I've been thinking most about is most of the questions as phrased combine. Well, let me back up. Coming from the perspective of not having the birth to 24 months in the dietary guidelines, I think we've been very food focused, which is the main point. But going now to the breast B to 24 age group, most of the questions treat breastfeeding and formula feeding equivalently. And I think it's going to be really important that we find some ways to look separately at the outcomes that involve breastfeeding separate from those from formula feeding. I think N. Haynes has them combined, so that probably won't be our source. We'll probably need to look to other literature. But I think that's a really critical piece of what this next phase should include.
Yeah, and I would go along with Rick and what I said earlier. I do think prevention of obesity is a key factor for everything that we're discussing, and really does need to be infiltrated across all of these questions as far as a #1 public health benefit that would be derived by potentially, in regard to what Carol was saying, a higher quality diet, and regardless of exactly what the macronutrient composition is, since we all are aware that, you know, the emphasis on healthy fats are good for you and all of that, I think there's huge confusion out there in regard to, you know, low fat, high fat, carbs, whatever. And so to try to be able to distinguish exactly what is being recommended and why, I think would be valuable. I also think the only other comment I would make based on what Rachel was just saying is the opportunity also to look at pregnant women and breast milk quality and their diet relationships, you know, does also introduce another whole new topic area that is understudied. And if there are data out there that would help to promote a type of diet during pregnancy that is in fact beneficial, you know, for childhood, infant development, I think that this would be a wonderful time to start that search.
So Elsie Tavares, Linda asked one of the questions I had. No, perfect. Which was really the question of looking at dietary. So under the Pregnancy and Lactation Subcommittee, there are a number of questions on dietary patterns consumed during pregnancy with pregnancy outcomes, but not with infant outcomes. And that's something that Linda just mentioned, which I think would be important to expand a bit on some of the infant outcomes of pregnancy dietary patterns. I had two other questions, and they relate to a potential expansion of what's under each of the subcommittees, which could be answered later. One of my questions was under the subcommittee of frequency of eating, and I wondered if timing of eating, and I think the question came up yesterday of kind of circadian aligned or circadian misaligned timing of eating is going to be addressed there, and again, don't need an answer now, but I thought that timing in particular, in addition to frequency, might be important. And then the other question I had under the birth to 24 months subcommittee was a question about complementary feeding. And again, there's the questions relate to the relationship between complementary feeding and a number of outcomes, but I wondered how much we are going to drill down to the questions about composition and sequencing of introduction of different foods. It does expand quite a bit that section of the subcommittee's questions, but something also that I was wondering as I looked at the complementary feeding questions.
Sure.
Yeah, what the heck. Just on the complementary foods, it just reminded me that the definition that, was it Julie? Yeah, mentioned where you expand that all across, childhood up to age 18. Did I misunderstand? You didn't. 2 years. 2 years, okay. Because it's much more narrowly understood, and in fact, it's really only in that second 6 months of life or second 8 months of life that typically we talk about complementary feeding, and it's really intended as a complement to the single food that an infant starts off on, and then the diet broadens. So if it was up to me, I would probably restrict it down to, let's say, ages 4 months to 1 year for complementary feeding, and then not think about it after that. Thank you.
This is kind of a logistics question. We've kind of brought up a variety of concepts that are related to cross-cutting issues, and just want to be sure that as a committee chair, I keep that in mind, and I'm sure the wonderful people I'll be working with will help me with that, but several have been brought up, and I know they can relate to the subcommittee that I'm a part of. So just making sure maybe there's a mechanism in place for that.
I have a question or consideration. In several dietary guidelines of other countries, are now seriously considering, the issues of sustainability. I know a little bit what happened 5 years ago. Nevertheless, as you know, food consumption is a major driver of the food system, and the food system has an impact not only on the health of the population, but the health of the planet. And it's necessary a healthy planet to continue producing food. So given the relevance of this issue, I wonder if despite what happened 5 years ago, if you as a scientist consider that that is relevant, I mean, to at least put on the table, I mean, and give some consideration, despite the outcome that may happen in 2 years. But I'm saying, as a scientist, I mean, I think we have the responsibility to think seriously about this issue and probably, again, try to incorporate into our recommendations.
So we're going to keep going, and things that we can comment on, we will, but others, many of the topics being raised, I think, go into thinking about how we structure the work. So.
This is Teresa Davis. So under the birth to 24 months group, we have looking at the relationship between specific nutrients from supplements and bone health, and looking at the relationship between complementary feeding and bone health, because we're well aware the importance of building bone during early life. So basically we can stave off osteoporosis and osteopenia later in life. But I think we need to also remember that building muscle in early life is important in staving off sarcopenia. So I think, we need to keep that in mind, particularly when we're looking at body composition. And so when we look at body composition, when we think of lean mass and fat mass and so forth, but it's not only just lean mass, but the function of the lean mass, the muscle as well.
This is Heather Leidy. Same thing, just wanted to reiterate that I think that when we're thinking about sarcopenia or the progression or the prevention of muscle health, what that looks like, whether it's functionality or even the quality of the muscle, we get that with body composition from a total lean mass, but that doesn't mean that the quality of the muscle is healthy. And so I think if it's possible within our realm of looking at that, because it's, body composition is across the board, but you don't really we see bone health, but we don't see that with muscle health, which is a critical component. And then another comment to what Rick had said too, in terms of, a lot of these different areas, there are some macronutrient questions that could be teased out very easily, whether it's, with beverages or eating frequency. And I don't know if the committee has the ability to do that. It is a direct sub-question around the global question. If that is the case, though, I guess my question is that something that the committee as a whole within each subcommittee would want to tackle? Because it's, I think the concern that I have is if we do it in, for example, beverages, as an example, that's maybe well and good, but if it's not translated then across the other topics, it's going to seem awkward that maybe one topic is talking about macronutrients and the other ones aren't. So I just don't know if that's a discussion for the committee in terms of if we think it's relevant within some of these to focus on macronutrients, to have that conversation. I know for beverages or eating frequency, some of those components may end up driving that. So whether that ends up going in the systematic review or not, I think it's a relevant topic, just a concern.
Jamie Sting, one comment about lactation. I think, I know we're going to be looking at quantity and quality, or quantity and composition of human milk, but making sure that we have a consistent way of capturing mixed feeding and intensity of lactation, because the literature can be a mess, and we need to make sure that we do that thoughtfully. And then a question that I apologize for not bringing up earlier, but it just occurred to me. We didn't discuss cancer recurrence. And I know that there's kind of that fine line between the disease state and not, but whether or not that is something that we would want to consider within our cancer questions.
Carol Boucher, and I don't really have a lot to add. I've really appreciated the comments up to this point, and I'm sure the others will be really great too. But I want to respond to Rick's comment. He brought up this idea of frequency of eating, and he said, I hope that's temporal patterns too. And then we also heard timing of eating. And maybe I missed the memo, but that's what I thought frequency of eating was. And I'm on that committee. So I will work to make sure that's blended in there. Thank you.
Reagan Bailey, just building on that, one of the things I wrote down specific for that committee is what is an eating occasion. So it's very difficult to define what is a snack, what is a meal. In NHANES, it's participant defined, but in other trials it may be different. So we'll need to standardize the language in working under that topic area. And I think it's great that we talked about the important influence of obesity as a cross-cutting issue across a lot of these committees. But there are other factors like blood pressure, physical activity, educational attainment that will greatly influence neurocognitive questions that we have. So we might want to also consider those within that lens as well.
Jamie Ard. So I'm going to sort of pick up on the obesity theme a little bit and ask or talk out loud about the idea of framing it more from an energy balance standpoint and having a unifying sort of approach across the subcommittees in terms of dietary patterns or various exposures in the context of an energy balance and being able to think about obesity is the consequence of energy imbalance. And so if we look at an energy, a dietary pattern in that state versus someone who may be consuming the same dietary pattern but in an excess calorie state, that may have different implications. And so in our literature, we need to be able to clearly help people understand that, have a consistent framework across the groups, because those macronutrient profiles and so forth the implications of that will vary based on energy balance state.
Beth Mayor Davis. So just picking up on this a little bit, I actually do think it's really important if we could think through our overall approach relative to obesity, because obesity is actually a mediator with regard to diet and not all of the other outcomes we're speaking of, but many of them, most of them. So I'm imagining, and when you think about this from a public health perspective and the percent of the population, including young children, adolescents throughout the life cycle, and we stop short with dealing with sarcopenia is another issue, but this is such a major public health problem, and it has been for so long. And I'm thinking that if we can, think about this overall frame, not 6 months from now, but when we're thinking about writing, but sooner than that, because it might help our thinking in terms of coherence both within and across the subcommittees. And I have this is much less interesting, but, as a practical issue, I just don't know if today we're going to do a little bit of conversation about logistics and, what's sort of the process, the expectations, how do we move forward in terms of subcommittees getting activated and, that kind of stuff. We're going to do that later. Is that right? Okay, good.
I think Eve will speak to that.
She'll give us marching orders. Good. Okay.
Steve Heimsfield, I had a few questions. One is, I'm chair of the frequency of eating group, and has there been something on that written already? Are we building on something, or is this a new topic? Might be able to answer that. No. Okay, so it's starting from zero. Okay, all right. And a few other minor things. To the extent that the food patterns are evaluated using new cutting-edge techniques like artificial intelligence, deep learning, I think all of those techniques are coming online very fast, and I was just wondering to the extent they'll be used as moving forward. And I was wondering about the boundaries of our evaluations. Do we include antibiotics in foods, hormones, chemical disruptors, and things like that that often travel with food?
Yeah. I think those are good clarifying questions.
Yeah, and ultra-processed food versus, so on. All of those questions I think are very topical. Yeah.
So I'll throw in one last-minute grenade here and ask if, small one, ask if another cross-cutting issue that is very important in public health is food insecurity. and it cross-cuts this issue of time of eating, frequency of eating, quality of diet, significant health consequences of it, behavioral as well as physical. And so I don't know whether I'm pushing for systematic reviews on this, but I know that the least I think that we should do is to make sure that that appears in our discussion as often as we can. And it's not in an effort to balance the discussion about obesity. It's really in addition to this issue of obesity so that it doesn't get lost. So.
Great. Well, these are excellent issues to have brought forward, and I think some of them will be addressed as the work groups start putting their work together and start working with the staff, that we'll be able to sort out how do these various things fit in or cut across the work groups. But I think some of them we can ask Eve and maybe Julie to help clarify. So why don't you all, and Janet, yeah. And I was trying to identify things that I thought could be questions clarified in this format. I think I've captured a lot of the issues, if I could read my own handwriting. But, you know, for example, one of the questions was about how do we interpret the question on low carbohydrate, high fat diets. So, I mean, that's a simple question about the question itself. How are we interpreting that?
I think in general, we're looking at any dietary pattern evidence that's available. So, I mean, low carbohydrate could be high fat, or some people do higher protein, so there's really different variations. So we're kind of open to whatever different types of macronutrient patterns there are found.
Well, and maybe while you're there, you could address the questions that kind of came up about looking at the macronutrients versus the foods, and how you see that playing out in the various questions.
Right, so I think that'll again come in the dietary pattern evidence. So where the evidence is available on those outcomes, we'll definitely take a look.
Okay, great. And I think there were some questions about infant outcomes in looking at pregnant women. And so is that something we can address now as far as?
Sure. Let me see. So I believe there was a question on, there was one on milk composition, which is in here, on the mother's diet and breast milk composition. And what was the other infant
The other
outcome?
one was, it seemed like a lot of the outcomes were for pregnancy, and you were asking, what about infant outcomes based on dietary intake during pregnancy?
So we have, yeah, I mean, we're welcome to add if we don't have the outcomes that you're looking for. We do have birth weight, gestational age, sex, but we can work on this in the protocol stage, definitely. So we know that's an important output.
And then there was a question about the time period that was selected for the complementary feeding, going all the way to 2 years. So is that something that you want the subcommittee to look at, that time period, or?
Yes, and I think the thought was that some women nurse, past 12 months, so there's not really and I know some, go past 24 months as well, so. But that definitely the subcommittee can take that on if they want to refine it.
Okay, great. And we had the question about introducing new topics such as sustainability that aren't part of the topics and questions. And I don't know whether, Janet, you want to address that, or Eve, do you want to address that?
Yeah, it's similar to what we said before. We've kind of laid out the major topics, but if there's something that you would like to address in the report, the committee is, welcome to do that.
Right, but it might be that we've identified something as important for the future, or something that we'd like the secretaries to consider.
Sure. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, and just to add, the committee is asked to limit its review of the evidence to the topics and questions that were identified by the departments that had the public and federal agency input. But so the systematic review support, the food pattern modeling, all of those pieces, limiting the review of evidence to those topics and questions. But yes, to your point, is there, and what we've discussed before, places in the report to speak to things that are also important to consider.
Right.
That other topics can be relevant there.
Okay. And certainly within this committee, I don't think we have the expertise directly, but that's another thing we can think about. So I think the cancer reoccurrence, that might be, again, we have to be careful to not dip into clinical guidelines and clinical practice. So, and then Steve asked a set of very focused questions right at the end. And we know its frequency of eating is new. What about techniques, newer techniques around food patterns? And what about some of the other factors that show up in foods? How should we be thinking about those issues?
So I think there was, so whatever's available in the evidence as far as I think the techniques for measuring food intake, I mean, if that's, a technique that's used in the evidence, definitely.
I was thinking more of the analysis methods,
yeah,
like deep learning, artificial intelligence is coming online very, very fast.
Right.
Yeah.
Now that's extremely interesting. That's probably on the methodology side, which would be outside the scope, but very interesting, and happy you can touch on it in the report and research gaps or can list it there.
Mm-hmm. So are there some other questions that I didn't bring up that you all captured in your notes that you thought we could address at this level?
I heard a number of people mention factors that are going to be important: confounders, mediators, moderators, covariates, that sort of thing. And certainly part of our systematic review process will be to have a very thorough discussion up front about all of those different factors, many of which you've mentioned here and others, that we need to really take into consideration as we start to dig into the evidence and really evaluate it. So all of those kinds of things that got mentioned, I think, are very important to the process.
And we didn't address the last question about some of these other factors in food, such as antibiotics. What all to do with chemicals? Yeah.
That's probably out of scope.
Yeah.
But I mean, for the systematic review. So, but
I think in general those are food safety issues.
Yeah.
Which
out of our lane.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So. We're going to have a robust other items in the report, right?
It's going to be big.
So were there any other items that you had identified that I think some of these will have to be addressed as the subcommittee looks at the protocol and begins to refine that, but some that I thought we could deal with here, we might as well.
Great. I will add one final comment to Dr. Bazzano's question about the types of dietary patterns. I think the intent, when you see the protocols, you'll see that the systematic review protocol, it casts a wide net. And we found in doing reviews over time that the labels are really tricky. If it's low carb or high fat, I mean, what does that really mean? And so in those reviews, it's often, you're getting into the foods and beverages, or the macronutrient composition or those different elements. So I think we listed a list of potential dietary patterns to consider, but I think it's casting a wide net. And then looking at the evidence base to identify those that are the relevant ones to include. And yes, it is the labels. It is hard to define just with the label of the pattern. So I think that'll kind of flesh out more once you see the protocol.
Great, thank you all for addressing those questions. So Eve, I'll turn it back to you for the wrap-up.
Excellent. Okay, so thank you. I want to start off by just, again, saying thank you to the committee. When we wrapped up yesterday, a colleague of mine said, I hope they come back. So thank you for coming back. I know that we've made a big ask. It is, this is a lot of work, and several of you, have you been here before, or your colleagues have told you it's a lot of work. So we just want to thank you again. I hope that you've seen over the course of the last 2 days that you're not on this alone. You have a lot of support who can help you and help you to accomplish your goals. In terms of immediate next steps, each of the subcommittees has specific subcommittee staff who will assist you in literally logistics, getting calls on the books and things like that. If you haven't met your respective, or the staff are going to meet their respective subcommittee chairs. If that hasn't happened yet, let's do that after the meeting, just a touch base to make sure you have that connection. So immediately, we'd like to begin those subcommittee discussions. So our staff will help you to work with you, the subcommittee chair, and then subsequently the subcommittee members to set up those calls and help with logistics. And we'll just get the ball rolling pretty immediately. And as has been discussed, what will happen is a discussion around the questions that are identified for each of the subcommittees. One of the things that'll happen, I think it'll kind of vary, but bringing up former systematic reviews that have been done by the Nutrition Evidence Systematic Review team that relate to these topics and questions, and also bringing forward draft protocols. And so those protocols will be brought to the subcommittees to refine, review, adapt, but you'll start with something. It's not a blank protocol. We'll provide something that you then react to and refine and make the subcommittees. So those are kind of the immediate next steps. Now, thanks everyone for being here. Meeting 1 is done. We have 4 more public meetings, and I presented these yesterday, but if you weren't able to be here, these are the dates for the remaining 4 meetings, and we hope that you can schedule and plan to be there. The next meeting is in July, and we hope to see you there. That will have an opportunity for oral comments to the committee. And there will be more information about that as we get closer to that meeting. And again, the second and the 4th meetings will have that opportunity for public comment, oral public comment to the committee. Registration for those meetings, again, will be announced at our website and then through our listserv. And just one final note, again, for those who weren't here yesterday, the 5th meeting we have scheduled for March, we've asked for the committees to submit its report in May. So that last meeting is really the discussion, bringing all of the final deliberations, findings to that last meeting, but there is some time after that to finish the report and submit it in May. Okay, so as the subcommittees conduct their work, so from now till July, there will be the opportunity for the public to follow along. As we've noted now several times, dietaryguidelines.gov is a great go-to source for information on what's happening in the process. 2 key pieces there is that there will be monthly updates around the subcommittee's work. So there will be brief subcommittee updates giving you an update on what's been happening over the course of the month. And that will also be the time that we'll update the protocols for the different scientific questions. So again, if you go to dietaryguidelines.gov, the way to follow that is to go to Work Underway and then to the Review of Science section within that. And here you can see the link for the topics and questions to be examined by the committee, and that's where we see that list of questions. And you can follow along, see which one's still to come. If there's not something there, it just hasn't been addressed by the subcommittee, the committee yet. And then developing the plan, implementing the plan, and having a draft conclusion. And again, we encourage you to follow along and stay engaged. There is at the bottom of dietaryguidelines.gov, a link to sign up for our listserv, and that is a great way. We definitely will continue to send out notifications as to what's happening, and so you can follow along. Now, in addition to thanking the committee, I do want to acknowledge that there are a lot of staff involved in helping to make this happen. You've heard a number of these individuals identified supporting the review of the evidence phase. So we have a systematic review team. We have teams devoted to food pattern modeling and data analysis. There are also a lot of other people engaged who will be helping you with public comments, who help with the website, who kind of help with the other elements that are involved in the committee's work. And we just want to give a huge thank you. Part of that also includes making meetings like this happen. And we don't have meeting planners, we have nutritionists who become meeting planners. And so I do want to just give a quick shout out to Colette Rahan and Jean Altman, who really did lead up the logistics for making this meeting happen. So overall, thank you. And these are people who have helped us to get to this point, people who are going to help us to get to the next meeting and beyond. So just thanks for that. And again, just acknowledging that there is this is something that both departments, USD and HHS, it's very important, and we appreciate your time and the dedication of the staff as well. So with that, unless there are any final questions or comments?
I would just make a comment that, yes, I like having that tick off on the first meeting, and I do want to express my appreciation to the committee members for being here, for raising questions, for bringing forward issues so that we can, in fact, do our work and make sure we come to the point where we're making recommendations that are useful to the government. And a big thank you to the staff. I think they've made our time very easy and really facilitated this process. So thank you very much. Thank you for the presentations, and thank you for everything to put it all together.
Ditto.
Well, thank you. And thanks to everyone who joined both. Thank you. Thanks for everybody who joined both in person and online. And again, we'll have meeting materials posted in the next couple of weeks, and we look forward to seeing you in July. Thank you.